Most people think money has one obvious price. They think the price is printed on the thing they want to buy, the sticker on the house, the monthly payment on the car, the stock quote blinking on a screen, the salary line inside a job offer. That is not the real price. The real price sits underneath all of it, quiet and merciless, like gravity. You cannot see gravity, but you build your whole life inside its pull. And in finance, the closest thing we have to gravity is the bond market. I have spent most of my life watching people study the visible objects and ignore the invisible force. They will spend 6 months debating whether a stock is expensive and 6 minutes thinking about what the bond market is saying. They will complain about home prices, layoffs, shrinking opportunity, and weak markets without realizing that all of those things are being tugged by the same hidden field. If you do not understand bonds, you do not understand money. And if you do not understand money, then you are not making financial decisions. You are just reacting to gravity after it has already knocked you down. The bond market is not some side room for economists in gray suits. It is the giant machine that prices time, rewards patience, punishes fantasy, and decides how easy or painful it will be for the entire economy to breathe. When that machine gets generous, people feel brilliant. When it gets strict, people suddenly call the world unfair. Usually it was the same world. The gravity just changed. The first mistake people make is believing a bond is complicated. A bond is simply an IOU with consequences. That is all it is. Somebody needs money now and promises to pay it back later with interest. A government can do it. A company can do it in ordinary life. A family does the same thing when it borrows for a house. The names get fancier, the math gets dressed up, the television panels get louder, but the principle never changes. Someone wants to use tomorrow as money today, and someone else decides what that impatience will cost. The United States government does this on a scale so large that most people stop feeling the size of it in the source material. The federal government took in about $4.9 trillion of tax revenue in 2024 and spent about $6.8 trillion. That left a gap of roughly $1.8 trillion that had to be financed somehow. Not with magic, not with slogans, with borrowing, with bonds. Faithfully cite Fayturn 250 That means the government goes to investors, institutions, pension funds, banks, foreign countries, and savers. And it says something very simple. Lend me money now, and I will pay you interest for the privilege of using it. Every time that promise gets made, the bond market is not just funding Washington. It is setting the baseline heartbeat for the whole financial system. I want you to hold on to one idea because it explains more than almost anything else in finance. The bond market is the gravity market. That is the mother line. If you understand that, everything else stops looking random. A lot of people think the stock market is the center of the financial universe because it is louder, more colorful, and easier to turn into entertainment. But noise is not power. Gravity is power. Bonds decide what safe money pays. Once that number moves, everything else in the economy has to renegotiate with reality. Before I take you into the deeper mechanics, I want to give you the 3 pieces that make a bond work, because once you understand them, the whole machine becomes less mysterious. The first is principal. That is simply the amount borrowed. The second is coupon. That is the interest payment promised to you. The third is maturity. That is how long the borrower has before the principal must be repaid. Principal, coupon, maturity. That is enough to start seeing the skeleton under the skin. Now comes the part that separates people who can repeat definitions from people who actually understand what moves markets. A bond is born in one place and priced in another. New bonds are issued in the primary market, but the economy does not really dance to the primary market. It dances to what happens after the bond is born, when old bonds begin trading against new reality. That is where gravity becomes visible. The source document explains this with what it calls a seesaw between price and yield. I would describe it in plain English like this. When new bonds come out offering better returns, old bonds have to become cheaper to compete. And when old bonds get cheaper, their yield rises. When new bonds offer worse returns, old bonds become more attractive, their price rises, and their yield falls. File cite Fayturn 250 That relationship sounds technical until you realize it is the master lever. Let's say you owned a bond paying $3 a year on a $100 principal. Then new bonds arrive offering $4 a year on the same principal. Your old bond suddenly looks ordinary. If you want someone to buy it from you, you must lower the price enough that the return on the buyer's money becomes competitive, price falls, yield rises. That is not trivia. That is gravity speaking. I call this mechanism yield gravity. Yield gravity is the force that drags every other asset back toward a baseline return for time and safety. If the market can get a stronger return from a safe bond, riskier assets have to work harder to justify themselves. If safe yields are tiny, investors go hunting farther out on the risk curve. Because gravity is weak and fantasies can float, that is why people confuse easy money with genius. They think they discovered talent when what they really discovered was low gravity. I watch this mistake happen over and over again during periods when safe yields sink. People stop asking disciplined questions. They stop distinguishing between a wonderful business and an exciting story. They stop caring what price they pay because gravity has temporarily loosened its grip. Then the bond market tightens and suddenly they rediscover arithmetic. That rediscovery is always painful. Now let me show you how yield gravity reaches directly into the life of an ordinary family. Most people believe the bank decides mortgage rates. The bank does not lead. The bank follows gravity. Banks look at what the bond market is paying, especially the yield on long-term government debt, and they use that as a benchmark. Then they add a spread because lending to a family is riskier than lending to the United States government. So when bond yields are low, mortgage rates can be low. When bond yields rise, mortgage rates rise with them. The source document points to January 2021, when the 10-year Treasury yield was around 1%, and mortgage rates were around 2.65%, and then to October 2023, when the 10-year yield reached roughly 5%, and mortgage rates moved above 8%. Fay file a site fay turn 2 file 0 fay. That is not a tiny difference. That is a life path difference. A 1-point move in rates is not just a number on television. It changes how much house a family can afford, how much cash they must devote to debt service, how far they can stretch, whether they move, whether they stay stuck, whether they postpone children, whether they turn down a job in another city because the financing no longer works. I call this mortgage gravity. Mortgage gravity is when the bond market quietly redraws the borders of the middle class. People love to talk about house prices as if they live in isolation. They do not. House prices are partly the visible shadow of borrowing costs when rates collapsed. Borrowing became cheap, more buyers could chase the same inventory, and home prices shot higher. The source document notes that home prices jumped 19% in 1 year around that period, far above the long-run average. Later, when rates moved sharply upward, affordability got crushed even though sellers were reluctant to cut prices because many owners were locked into very low mortgages from earlier years. Fay-felicite fay turn 2 file 0 fay. That is why people can feel trapped in a housing market that makes no intuitive sense. Demand cools, but prices do not collapse the way the textbooks promised, because existing owners are glued to yesterday's cheap financing and refuse to trade a good mortgage for a bad one. That trap has a lesson far bigger than housing. Cheap money can freeze behavior long after conditions change. When gravity moves, human beings do not adapt instantly. They cling to the old world. That lag creates the strange market conditions that confuse everybody who thinks price is driven by one variable at a time. The same force reaches into the stock market, and this is where investors make one of their most expensive mistakes. They judge stocks in a vacuum. No intelligent investor should ever do that. A stock is not just a business, it is a business priced against alternatives. If I can get a very attractive return from a risk-free or near risk-free government bond, then the extra return I demand from stocks must be meaningfully higher to compensate me for uncertainty. The source document frames this as the equity risk premium, the gap between what investors expect to earn from stocks and what they can lock in from government bonds. Fay-felicite fay turn 2 file 0 fay. I call this valuation gravity. Valuation gravity is the force that decides how much enthusiasm the market can afford when safe bonds yielded next to nothing. Investors were willing to pay rich prices for future earnings because the alternatives were miserable. That helped fuel the long expansion in stock valuations through the low-rate era. But when bond yields rose toward 4% and 5%, the hurdle changed. Suddenly, investors could get an attractive guaranteed return without owning fragile dreams, over-leveraged business models, or overhyped narratives. So stocks had to compete again. Some could, many could not. The source document points to the market drawdown in 2022 as money moved toward the higher yields available in bonds. Fay-felicite fay turn 2 file 0 fay. This is why I have always cared about price, far more than popularity. In low gravity periods, people pay almost any multiple for a business with a fashionable story because gravity is not pressing very hard. In high gravity periods, markets become less forgiving. Future promises are discounted more aggressively. Businesses that need years of perfect execution to justify today, S valuations suddenly look much less attractive. Gravity exposes the difference between a business and a prophecy. There is a psychological trap buried here that you need to see clearly. When safe yields are low, investors feel brave. When safe yields are high, investors feel smart for being cautious. Usually they are just being pulled around by yield gravity and calling the sensation personal insight. That is why I've always said temperament matters more than IQ in investing. The bond market does not simply change prices. It changes what stories people are willing to believe. When gravity is light, greed feels rational. When gravity is heavy, prudence feels inevitable. If you do not know which environment you are in, you will mistake mood for wisdom. Now, I want to move from your mortgage and your portfolio to something even more personal, your job. Most employees think job security comes from company culture, leadership quality, innovation, or consumer demand. Those things matter. But behind them sits another force that becomes brutally important whenever money is no longer cheap. Companies borrow too. Some do it openly through corporate bonds. Some do it through loans. Many growing businesses use borrowed money to fund hiring, expansion, acquisitions, equipment, research, and survival between cycles. When rates are low, that borrowing feels manageable. When rates rise and old debt must be refinanced, what looked manageable can become a vice around the throat. The source material gives a simple example. A company that borrowed when government yields were around 1% and issued its own debt around 3% might later have to refinance in a world where government yields are 5% and investors demand perhaps 7% from that company. That is more than double the interest burden. When debt service explodes, management cuts somewhere, stores close, projects die, hiring freezes, workers leave or are pushed out. That is one reason layoffs surged in the higher rate environment of 2023 and 2024. Felicite Fay turn 2 file 0 Fay I call this refinancing gravity. Refinancing gravity is when yesterday's cheap optimism turns into today's layoffs. That sentence is worth remembering because it explains a lot of suffering that people misdiagnose. They think management suddenly became cruel. Sometimes management was always mediocre. Sometimes the product really did weaken. But many times the real problem is simpler. The company built itself on the assumption that gravity would stay light forever. It borrowed aggressively, expanded proudly, and treated cheap money as if it were permanent. Then the bond market changed its mind. A lot of modern careers are built inside businesses that are more rate sensitive than the employees realize. This is why I want you to stop describing yourself only by your job title. If your income depends on a heavily indebted employer, your real profession may not be marketing manager or software engineer or sales director. Your real profession may be employee inside a leveraged structure. That is a much less comfortable sentence, but it is often more accurate. And accuracy is where financial freedom begins. This is the identity flip most people never make. They stay in the identity of participant. I want you to move into the identity of observer. The participant lives inside gravity and blames the weather. The observer studies gravity and positions early. That is one of the biggest upgrades I can offer you. Stop thinking like a consumer of financial conditions. Start thinking like an owner studying the cost of money. The day you make that shift, the headlines stop looking like random chaos. You begin to see why housing freezes, why speculative stocks crack, why private companies miss payroll, why layoffs arrive in clusters, why venture funding dries up, why commercial real estate goes quiet, why banks become picky, why prudence suddenly becomes fashionable again. It is not because the world developed a new personality. Gravity changed. There is another mechanism in the source material that deserves attention because it tells you when fear is rising inside credit markets. The spread between safe government bonds and riskier corporate bonds widens when investors demand more compensation for uncertainty. In plain language, when people start worrying about whether companies can pay them back, they ask for much higher yields than the government has to pay. The source calls this the high yield spread. Felicite Fay turn 2 file 0 Fay. I call this fear gravity. Fear gravity is the market's way of saying, I no longer believe tomorrow is as stable as yesterday. You do not need to be a bond trader to use that information. You just need to respect what it means. A widening spread is a warning flare. It tells you that credit is tightening, refinancing is becoming more painful, and weak balance sheets are moving closer to exposure that matters to investors, business owners, job holders, and even home buyers, because credit stress leaks into every corner of the economy. This is why bonds are not boring. They are only boring to people who think consequences are boring. The bond market tells you what time costs, what safety pays, what risk demands, what growth deserves, and what overconfidence will eventually be charged for. That is not dry theory. That is the pricing engine of real life. Now, I want to take you deeper because understanding the machine is not enough. You need to know how human beings repeatedly get trapped by it. The biggest trap is that people evaluate money in pieces instead of systems. They ask, can I handle this monthly payment? That is the language of weakness. The stronger question is, what kind of gravity am I agreeing to live under? If you buy a house when yields are distorted, invest in stocks without comparing them to bond alternatives, join a debt-soaked employer, and carry your own expensive liabilities, you have built a life with several layers of gravity working against you at once. It may still function in good weather, but when gravity increases, your margin disappears. Most people do not go broke from one dramatic mistake. They go broke by stacking invisible pressures. A mortgage negotiated under heavy gravity, a stock portfolio bought without a return hurdle, a job tied to refinancing risk, a personal budget that requires perfect conditions, an emergency fund too small for a world where money has become expensive. Put those together and you do not have a financial plan. You have a fragile structure hoping rates move in your favor. I have no interest in hoping my way through markets. Hope is cheap. Optionality is expensive and worth paying for. That brings me to the part most people skip because they like explanations more than discipline. How do you make the bond market work for you instead of against you? You do it by building what I would call a gravity protocol, not a prediction game, not a headline addiction, a protocol. The first principle of the gravity protocol is to respect the baseline. Before you invest $1 in something risky, know what safe money is paying. If government bonds are offering attractive yields, your required return for risk should go up. That does not mean you abandon stocks. It means you stop behaving as though all environments deserve the same appetite. Every investment should be compared against what you can earn with much less uncertainty. If you skip that step, you are not allocating capital. You are daydreaming. The second principle is to shorten your promises. The more expensive money becomes, the more dangerous long chains of fixed obligations can be. Long-duration fantasies suffer most under heavy gravity in personal finance. That means being careful with debts that lock you into fragile assumptions in investing. It means being suspicious of assets whose value depends entirely on distant future perfection. In business, it means not building a cost structure that only works if refinancing stays easy. The third principle is to keep liquidity close. Cash does not always look brilliant, but optionality rarely looks brilliant until the moment everybody else needs it. When gravity increases, the people with liquidity are not just safer, they become buyers while others become forced sellers. The source material shows how rising yields can pressure houses, stocks, and employers all at once. If you keep some financial oxygen, you can survive that pressure without selling your best assets in a weak moment. Fe Felicite Fe Turn 2 File 0 Fe. The fourth principle is to separate your identity from cheap money. A lot of modern self-confidence was built on a period when money was unusually easy. People began to confuse favorable financing conditions with permanent personal strength. That is dangerous. I do not care how successful a person looked in a low gravity world. If every part of that success depended on cheap refinancing, inflated multiples, or buyers who could only show up because rates were pinned to the floor. I want to know what remains when gravity returns. The fifth principle is to own productive things, not just exciting things when safe yields rise. Speculative assets become less charming. Productive businesses with real cash generation, pricing power, durable demand, and strong balance sheets become more valuable relative to dreams. A wonderful business can still be a wonderful business under heavier gravity. A story stock often cannot. The bond market forces discipline back into the definition of quality. The sixth principle is to read your paycheck through the lens of credit. This is where the identity flip becomes practical. Do not just ask whether your employer is growing. Ask how it is funded. Does it depend on rolling debt? Does it need constant financing to maintain operations? Does it have to refinance into a harsher rate environment soon? Is its business model robust enough to carry much higher interest expense? The source material makes clear that when borrowing costs jump, companies cut people to save the structure. Fe File Site Fe Turn 2 File 0 Fe. You may not control the bond market, but you can control how exposed your household is to businesses that never learn to live without cheap money. The seventh principle is to use bonds as tools, not trivia. A lot of people treat bonds as something you graduate into when you get old, tired, or frightened. That is, childish. Bonds are not surrender. Bonds are instruments. They can provide liquidity, income, stability, dry powder, and psychological resilience. In some environments, a decent government yield can be a serious competitor to mediocre equity ideas. Intelligent investing is not about acting loyal to one asset class. It is about weighing alternatives. Honestly, the eighth principle is to refuse forced timing. Most people lose because they are pushed, not because they are wrong. They lose because debt matures at the wrong moment, because a layoff arrives when reserves are thin, because a large payment collides with a tight credit market, because they need cash exactly when markets are weak. Gravity punishes bad timing most severely when that timing is no longer optional. So your protocol must create slack. Time is not just money. Time is bargaining power. I have seen enough cycles to know this much. When gravity is low, people want speed. When gravity is high, what they really need is endurance. That is why my temperament has always leaned towards strength, liquidity, patience, and understandable businesses. I am not interested in impressing people during easy periods if the price is dependence during hard periods. The bond market eventually reveals whether your prosperity was earned or borrowed from a friendlier rate environment. I also want to say something uncomfortable. Many people spend years trying to beat the stock market before they have learned how the bond market is setting the table beneath them. That is like trying to win a chess match while ignoring where the board is tilted. You can still make a few good moves, but the structure is working on you whether you acknowledge it or not. The source material ends by suggesting that if you understand bonds, you can make the market work for you rather than against you. I agree with that. But I would say it more sharply: if you ignore the bond market, you volunteer to be managed by other people. As understanding, mortgage lenders, corporate treasurers, bankers, private equity firms, asset allocators, and disciplined investors will all be adjusting to gravity while you wonder why life suddenly got expensive. Fe Felicite Fe Turn 2 File 0 Fe I do not like volunteering for ignorance. I would rather know the field I am walking through. There is a second identity flip hidden here, and it matters just as much as the first. Most people think of bonds as something the government does. I want you to start seeing bonds as the language of power. Who gets to borrow cheaply? Who must pay dearly? Who gets patience? Who gets pressure? Who can survive a long winter? Who gets shaken out? Once you understand that, you stop hearing interest rates as abstract policy. You hear them as social architecture. They decide who can roll forward and who gets trapped in place. This is why bond literacy is not optional for anyone serious about money. It is not enough to know how to pick a ticker. You need to know what environment that ticker is breathing in. It is not enough to know your home estimate. You need to know the gravity pressing on mortgage demand. It is not enough to feel grateful for your salary. You need to know the financing pressure above your employer's head. It is not enough to say you are long-term. You need to know what safe money is paying while you wait. A lot of investors use the word long-term as an excuse for not doing basic comparison. That is not patience. That is laziness in formal clothing. Long-term investing works best when it is built on clear standards. What is the return hurdle today? What is the opportunity cost of risk? What happens if refinancing gets worse? What assumptions does this valuation require? What conditions must remain unusually favorable for this plan to survive? Those are bond market questions even when you think you are talking about something else. Now let me turn this from analysis into instruction. If I were speaking to my younger self, I would say this: do not let a low-rate world teach you the wrong lessons. Do not assume cheap mortgages are normal. Do not assume every company can refinance forever. Do not assume exciting equities deserve high multiples because they did yesterday. Do not assume your job is safe because your department is busy. Do not assume a portfolio is diversified just because it owns many tickers if all of them depend on the same easy money backdrop. And do not assume a safe asset is automatically stupid because it looks less glamorous than a high-flying stock. A guaranteed return is not boring when uncertainty is expensive. There is a deep human tendency to want financial life to be simple and moral. We want to believe good people get rewarded, hard workers move forward, and attractive ideas attract capital because they deserve it. Sometimes that happens, but the bond market is not a morality tale. It is a pricing engine. It does not care how badly you want low mortgage rates or richly valued growth stocks or endless venture funding or painless refinancing. It only cares what lenders demand for time, inflation risk, default risk, and uncertainty. That indifference is precisely why the bond market deserves your respect. It does not flatter you, it does not entertain you, it does not ask for your belief, it simply prices the world, and then everybody else adapts. I have always preferred hard truths to comforting theater. Hard truths compound better. Here is one of them. If you build your financial life assuming gravity will stay light, you are borrowing confidence from a machine you do not control. That is a dangerous way to live. Far better to build a structure that can stand under heavier gravity than the present moment requires. Keep leverage reasonable. Demand sufficient return for risk. Own quality, preserve liquidity. Study the cost of money. Avoid businesses and personal obligations that only work in a forgiving environment. Learn to recognize when the baseline has changed. That is how you stop being a victim of the bond market and start becoming a student of it. And now I want to leave you with the real test, because soft endings are for people who want to feel thoughtful without changing anything. You have a choice. You can keep living as if prices are the whole story, as if the sticker is the truth, as if your mortgage quote came from a generous bank, as if your stock portfolio exists in a vacuum, as if your job stands outside the credit cycle, as if safe returns do not matter, as if gravity is somebody else's problem. Or you can sign a different contract with your future self. You can decide that from this point on, before you buy, borrow, invest, or depend, you will ask the better question: what kind of gravity am I stepping into? That one question will save you from more bad decisions than most financial books ever will. Because once you start asking it, you cannot unsee the field. You will see it in home affordability. You will see it in stock valuations. You will see it in layoffs. You will see it in credit spreads. You will see it in your employer's balance sheet. You will see it in your own household's resilience. And then you will face the mirror. Did you build your life on productive strength, patience, and optionality? Or did you build it on the assumption that money would stay cheap, risk would stay mispriced, and gravity would remain kind? One of those lives gets more powerful when the world tightens. The other one gets exposed. That is the threshold. Cross it, and you stop reacting to markets like a passenger. Ignore it. And sooner or later, gravity will teach you anyway.